Well, welcome to the fifth out of our six Scriptural Reasoning for Teachers sessions. The theme for today is going to be what makes a good leader, and we've got three wonderful people who are going to come and explain a little bit about what that looks like within the Buddhist tradition, the Muslim tradition, and in the Christian tradition. So welcome and thank you for watching this, and we hope that you will learn something really interesting as we go through the process of thinking through what makes a good leader from different perspectives. So just before we do start, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to what scriptural reasoning is if you're not familiar. So scriptural reasoning is a tool for interfaith dialogue where people from different faiths come together to read and reflect on their scriptures. Unlike some forms of interfaith engagement, it's not about seeking agreement, but rather exploring the texts and the possible interpretations across faith boundaries, and maybe learning to disagree better. The result is often a deeper understanding of others and one's own scriptures, as well as the development of strong bonds across faith communities. SR is now practiced globally, including places that have been affected by religious-related tensions and conflicts. And it's a real source where people can come together and begin to explore and mend bridges across divides. So this afternoon, as I said, we're going to be looking at the theme of what makes a good leader. We're going to explore that through some of our sacred texts. So we have three people who are going to come, and each of them is going to just introduce their text, read their story from their text, and then just explain a little bit about what it is that makes them significant. And then they will have a chance to ask each other a few questions, maybe clarifications or an observation. And then at the end, we will have the second person, and we will rotate round until each three people has had a chance to just share from their texts. And then right at the end, we will have an opportunity for any questions that people may have if they would like to know a little bit more. So I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, Professor Vicky Squire, who is from Warwick University, and she is part of the Political and International Studies Department there. She's completed her PhD and MA from the University of Exeter, and she's joining particularly today because one of the hats that she wears is that she is part of the team at Warwick University Chaplaincy, where she's the Buddhist faith advisor. And that's where I first encountered her, and she's very kindly agreed to come and share with us something of the wisdom of what makes a good leader from the Buddhist tradition. So I'm going to hand over to you, Vicky. Thank you so much for being willing to come and share, and over to you.
Great, many thanks, Anne. And so I'm going to share today the parable of the Phantom City. And now this is from the Lotus Sutra, one of the most influential texts in the Mahayana tradition. And Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes the one path to Buddhahood, and it emphasizes the importance of remaining in the world of suffering for the enlightenment of self and others. The Lotus Sutra also emphasizes the potential of all beings to become Buddhas. So I'm going to read this section of the Lotus Sutra now. Let us suppose there is a stretch of bad road, 500 yojanas long, steep and difficult, wild and deserted, with no inhabitants around, a truly fearful place. And suppose there are a number of people who want to pass over this road so they can reach a place where there are rare treasures. They have a leader of comprehensive wisdom and keen understanding who is thoroughly acquainted with this steep road, knows the layout of its passes and defiles, and is prepared to guide the group of people and go with them over this difficult terrain. The group he is leading, after going part way on the road, become disheartened and say to the leader, "We are utterly exhausted and fearful as well. We cannot go any farther. Since there is still such a long distance ahead, we would like now to turn around and go back. So the leader, a man of many expedients, thinks to himself, what a pity that they should abandon the many rare treasures they are seeking and want to turn and go back. Having had this thought, he resorts to the power of expedient means, and when they have gone 300 yojanas along the steep road, conjures up a city. He says to the group, don't be afraid, you must not turn back, for now here is a great city where you can stop, rest, and do just as you please. If you enter this city, you will be completely at ease and tranquil. Then later, if you feel you can go on to the place where the treasure is, you can leave the city. At that time, the members of the group, being utterly exhausted, are overjoyed in mind, exclaiming over such an unprecedented event. Now we can escape from this dreadful road and find ease and tranquility. The people in the group thereupon press forward and enter the city, where, feeling that they've been saved from their difficulties, they have a sense of complete ease and tranquility. At that time, knowing that the people have become rested and are no longer fearful or weary, the leader wipes out the city and says to the group, you must go now. The place where the treasure is close by. That great city of a while ago was a mere phantom that I conjured up so that you could rest. Okay, so that's the end of the reading. Now, I'm a Buddhist from the Nichiren tradition. This was founded in 13th century Japan, and I practice as part of a lay organisation called Soka Gakkai International. And it's worth highlighting from the start, there are many different Buddhist schools, and the perspective I will provide is distinctive to the SGI. And if you were to speak to someone from the Theravada or Tibetan traditions, or even other schools from within the Mahayana tradition, the perspectives would vary. So I chose this parable because the Lotus Sutra is an important founding text for the Buddhism of Nichiren Daishonin. Nichiren identified the Lotus Sutra as the true teaching of the Buddha that transcends all expedient or provisional teachings. The leader in the parable represents the Buddha, who has the wisdom to guide and support others to find the place where the treasure is. And he employs what's called an expedient means, the phantom city, to guide his followers to the greater truth of the one vehicle, or to the path of enlightenment. So that path, or we could translate this as our experience as ordinary people in the troubled world, that path is difficult. And as the parable explains, it's only natural to want to give up along the way. Rather than misleading then, expedient means in Buddhism refers to temporary or provisional teachings that are presented in a way that the Buddha's followers can understand. So the Lotus Sutra is the teaching that represents the importance of moving from those provisional teachings or expedient means to the one vehicle. And finding a place where the treasure is here stands as a metaphor for the realization of enlightenment. Or to put it another way, it represents the journey through which all people can realize their inherent Buddha nature. The Buddha, or the leader here, is not a supernatural being, but rather serves as a guide to help people recognize the qualities of the Buddha that they inherently possess. So the leader and the follower, or the Buddha and the ordinary person, are not viewed in mutually exclusive terms in Nichiren Buddhism, but rather the leader supports the follower to fulfill their inherent potential, while the follower's success in this regard proves the leader's qualities as a Buddha. And this is known as the mentor-disciple relationship. For example, in a letter called Flowering and Bearing Grain, written in 1278 to express gratitude for his deceased mentor from the Seichoji temple in Japan, Nichiren Daishonin says that if a teacher has a good disciple, both will gain the fruit of Buddhahood. But if teacher and disciple are of different minds, they will never accomplish anything. So the mentor-disciple relationship in Nichiren Buddhism involves a profoundly egalitarian relation rather than one of hierarchy or authority. And it's been central to the development of the lay organization Soka Gakkai, or Value Creating Society, which was founded in 1930 by Sunsaburo Makaguchi and his disciple Josei Toda. And they were imprisoned during the Second World War under state Shintoism, where Makaguchi died. Toda and the current Soka Gakkai president, Daisaku Ikeda, rebuilt the lay organization after the war, and it's now a worldwide movement that's committed to fostering peace and friendship based on respect and compassion. What's notable, I think, is there's a very strong emphasis within that movement on fostering youth as leaders. And as Ikeda says, a true leader fosters young people and spurs them on to greater heights. Thank you.
I think, Anne, you're on mute.
Thank you, Vicky, for that wonderful story, and what a lot of content and information, very rich information that you've provided for us to reflect on. I'm going to invite Robbie, if you would like to respond. I wonder whether there's anything that struck you about the story, or any points of clarification that you'd like, and then I'll ask Isa in a moment. Robbie, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Vicky, for introducing that really extraordinary story. I loved it. I suppose what struck me about the story was that leadership always happens in a context, and the sense of place is really strong in this story. And I think in one of the opening lines we heard, this unpassable road is in this place of wild, deserted, truly fearful wilderness. And I wondered, I was then really struck by the difference between sort of physical place, the physically fearful place, and then a kind of mental place, and the connection between the two, between the Phantom City, which is conjured, and then the place where the treasure is. And the surprise for me was that I was kind of expecting that when the leader conjures this imaginary place, that people wouldn't be duped, that they would they would accept that it was some sort of parable, that it was some sort of phantom, that they allowed them mental tranquility. But they seem to be really convinced that they're in a place. And I wondered then at the end, are they really going to a place where the treasure is, or is that also a phantom? Is it therefore about mental space? And is the real destination that they've moved beyond that place of fear, the wilderness that they started in, the unpassable place, and that what they thought was a physical journey is actually something else? And I wondered if you might help me on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for those very insightful comments. Yeah, and I think when you were speaking, that relationship between the physical and the mental, from the perspective of Buddhism, we have a kind of concept of the oneness of self and environment, which I think reflects this point that you're kind of making about, is this physical or is this mental? And actually, from the perspective of the oneness of self and environment, you wouldn't make that sort of strict separation. So you precisely wouldn't have this sort of idealized place that one needs to get to, a physical place, in order to achieve enlightenment, but rather through the process of seeking to attain enlightenment and drawing out one's qualities of Buddhahood, one is transforming the environment within which one's living as well. So we have a very strong emphasis in Nichiren Buddhism on something called Kozen Rufu, which is world peace, or world peace based on the principles of Buddhism. And the Mahayana Buddhist tradition it has this idea, as I introduced, about the importance of staying in the world to transform the suffering of self and other, right? So it's not about exiting to somewhere called nirvana, but living in this troubled world and, you know, seeking to find peace within that world. So yes, it's about the kind of that sort of mental experience of life, but it's more than that as well, that mental transformation also has an impact on the world that creates value and peace in the world.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was a wonderful observation. Isa, I wonder whether you have any questions or points of clarification that you would value from Vicky at this stage.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vicky. The thing which struck me from the text, one of the things, was the description of the leader as a man of expedience. It's something you also highlighted. And I found it interesting because often when we talk about moral leadership, it's about ideals, whereas this appears to be an emphasis on the pragmatic side of leadership. And I was just wondering whether there is a room for ideals in your strand of Mahayana Buddhism, and how that substantive conception of leadership would interact with the more pragmatic, expedient dimension that's being described in the text. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, I mean, I guess underlying this, this story comes within the context of the sutra as a whole, which actually moves beyond expedience. And the expedience, that sort of pragmatic leadership, as you describe it, is associated with Shakyamuni Buddha's earlier teachings, which are, as I said, they're provisional. So it's kind of that they're not doing away with the kind of ideal of enlightenment, but rather recognizing that in the times, those ideals might just not be something that people could connect to or understand. And the Lotus Sutra then is, as I said, it's about this one vehicle, that the path to enlightenment, that every person can achieve enlightenment, which is much more along the lines of that sort of ideal, I guess, if you want to put it in those terms. So again, I think, I think in terms, translating it in terms of leadership, I think there's a very strong emphasis on what we might call ideals, and a kind of aspirational leadership, kind of making the impossible possible is something that I often hear as a Buddhist, that, we really strive to kind of live great lives, live great, good lives, value creating lives. At the same time as recognizing we're living in a difficult world, and ideals aren't easy to achieve. So there's a kind of continued aspiration, I guess, towards ideals, but a kind of a realism embedded in that as well, but not a realism that is compromising, a realism that we're seeking ways to challenge. Yeah, so thanks. Great question.
Thank you so much, Vicky. What a lot of food for thought. I think just hearing the comments and the observations that have come out of that story is just highlights how rich these texts are and how much you can get out of them from reading and talking about them. And you often see things maybe you hadn't seen before by somebody else's perspective. So thank you, Vicky. That's been really helpful. I'm going to ask Isa if he'd like to share from his text now. And I think Bob is going to put up the PowerPoint on the screen for Isa to share. Now, Isa, I know Isa because he's the husband of a very dear friend of mine who is co-leader of this project. And he is the father of two of the most amazing, beautiful children I know, Nua and Baraka. But he's also widely recognized as a scholar in his own right. So he started off studying engineering, but he's then gone on to study classical Arabic and Islamic studies at Cambridge Islamic College, which has then took him on to do a master's degree at Cambridge University. And he's currently studying at the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford University, doing a DPhil there. And I know it takes a lot of his time and he's working very hard, and it's a fascinating topic. I'm just really honoured that he's giving up some time this afternoon to be with us and to share something from his perspective and his faith tradition about what makes a good leader. So Isa, would you like to share for us?
Thank you for a very generous introduction. So I'm just waiting for the slide.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, right. So I'm going to just introduce the text and why I chose it. So the verses that I'm going to discuss are from the chapter of the Quran known as Al Imran, and they are responding to an incident in the life of the Prophet. I should just mention, for those who don't know, the Quran, Muslims believe the Quran was revealed over a period of 23 years to the Prophet Muhammad, and it's intimately tied up with his life and the incidents and happenings of his life and of his early followers. And the incident that this verse pertains to is a battle which took place between the believers, the followers of the Prophet, and the people of Mecca who were persecuting them for their beliefs. And in this battle, which was actually a defeat for the Muslims, and there was an incident where a group of the believers actually fled from the battle, a small group, for reasons debated, whether it was because they thought that the Prophet had died or because they thought that they had lost the battle, but nonetheless they fled, and as a result the battle was eventually lost. And perhaps it's actually, maybe I'll read the verses now and then discuss the significance to me. So can we move to the verses? So that's the context, and I'll just read the verses and then mention why I think they're significant. So it is out of Allah's mercy that you, O Prophet, have been lenient with them. Had you been cruel or hard-hearted, they would have certainly abandoned you. So pardon them, ask Allah's forgiveness for them, and consult with them in conducting matters. Once you make a decision, put your trust in Allah. Surely Allah loves those who trust in Him. If Allah helps you, none can defeat you. But if He denies you help, then who else can help you? So in Allah, let the believers put their trust. So as you can see, these verses describe the response of the Prophet to these people who fled, and subsequently led to the failure in this battle. And it's described here as leniency. The word in Arabic, I think, could also be translated as softness, gentleness, tenderness. And for me, this is striking because I think one of the, it's easy to talk about being forgiving, but I think especially in the wake of such a disaster as, a defeat of the kind that this was, and especially when people have let you down or, not lived up to the standards that you expect, I think that's, in that first instance, it's most difficult to be forgiving and to be lenient. And that to me, it suggests that it's not a sort of a performance. If someone is able, in the very first instance, when faced with defeat, when faced with betrayal, or faced with whatever it may be, if your initial and first response is to be soft and lenient and forgiving, then that suggests that it's something deeply ingrained in your character. And that to me is the quality that I most associate with prophetic leadership that's modeled in the Quran. There's a tradition, a saying of the Prophet that's related by one of the commentators on this verse that links this virtue of forbearance, particularly with leaders. And it goes, there is no forbearance more beloved to God than the forbearance of a leader. and there is no intemperance or hated than the intemperance of the leader. So this notion that forbearance and patience is something that is uniquely and powerfully associated with being in a position of leadership, I think is something that comes out very strongly and is something that for me is central to the paradigm that we have in Islam of prophetic leadership. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Isa. That's really interesting. I wonder whether or not I can invite Vicky. Would you like to respond to that? Is there anything that you would like to ask for clarification, or any comments or observations that you've made?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed it. And I really appreciated your interpretation of it. I thought the kind of point about had you been cruel or hard-hearted, they would have abandoned you, came through strongly for me. And I was, the kind of forgiveness that comes from the leader. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the actions of those who fled, because it's how I interpreted it was that sort of Allah's forgiveness comes from kind of a sort of sincerity in a way of the believers, that they fled out of fear, but they were not cruel. They might have had a moment of weakness, but they fled out of that sort of fear, and however they also had deep faith in Allah, right, and trust how he would respond to their action. This is how I interpreted it. So I wanted to ask you, is that kind of the right way to be interpreting this? And then then the question, I suppose, when it comes to leadership is, there's an element of discernment as well, perhaps, as well as forbearance, as to when to make that decision, of forgiveness, and when perhaps a more stern response might be required, if I could use that word, that term. So yeah, please kind of elaborate on it for me, because I'd like just to understand that more deeply, please.
Of course, yeah. No, so I think the interpretation is correct. I mean, largely speaking, these weren't people that, it wasn't an act of deceit. It wasn't, these were sincere believers as they're described. And so they fled for various reasons. Some say it was because fear. Some interpreters suggest it was because they thought actually the battle had already been lost, which was not the case. All of which to say is that it was at the very worst a moment of weakness, which of course is to be dealt with compassion. And I think there's a wider point, similar to what we were talking about earlier, about recognizing people's shortcomings, and the relationship between ideals and pragmatism. At the end of the day, even despite the intense faith of these people, and despite the fact that the great burdens that they were able to carry until that point, in being a small group that was suffering under persecution and so on, they still were human, and they still were able to culpable to weakness. And so yes, there's certainly an element that the dynamic that I think you mentioned is at play, and same with the idea of discernment. I mean, there are incidents, for example, in other incidents where there are people who are acting out of malice, or they're not sincere, and the way that they're dealt with is different. So it is the fact that these were sincere people who were sincere with God and who felt regret for what they did, that leads to how God advises the prophet to deal with them. One thing I would note is that this is after the fact. I mean, the verses come after the fact. The prophet has already dealt with these people, and I think it's instructive that whilst now God is vindicating his approach and explaining and perhaps providing that divine insight on what happened or the intentions. In the prophet, for the prophet's perspective, he didn't know all of that necessarily. His initial response to them wasn't based necessarily on knowing the full details of the situation. So I think there's a more general statement about the prophet's disposition, and this verse, "Have you been cruel or hard-hearted?" It's a more universal statement as well, because it's about how he dealt with these people, but it's also about his personality and why he was such a magnet for these people in the first place. Why they would have certainly abandoned you is not just about, it is about in the years preceding this event, why did they stick with him through thick and thin? It's because he wasn't like that. And I think that's what I was getting at with this idea of the essential prophetic characteristics. But yes, thank you for a very perceptive question.
Thank you, Vicky, for that lovely question, and thank you, Isa, for your response. I'm just going to ask Robbie, would you like to comment or make any observations for clarification?
Thank you. Yeah, I think my observation and question was along similar lines. It was about the source of the prophet's leadership being in Allah's mercy. It's interesting that it seems to me that these people have already breached the trust, maybe by accident, maybe through cowardice, but there's some sort of loss of trust going on here. And is it possible to have the text back? Sorry, I was just using the I was just about to look at a line and refer to it. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, so but what's so fascinating is that there's a way back. They have a chance. They're actually, the prophet is encouraged to seek their loyalty, to bring them back into the fold, and actually even consult with them and on how to conduct matters and make decisions. So I just find, I suppose there was for me a sort of chain of trust and a chain of mercy that God wants to attract these people back into partnership, and the prophet knows to welcome them back in and to even consult them, even though maybe they've already shown a lack of trust or a lack of faith on some level, but there's a way back for them. And that is also connected in the first verse there in 159, that it's out of Allah's mercy. It's not in the prophet's gift per se. It's only because he is himself rooted in God's mercy. So more of an observation, but I wonder if you wanted to comment on that.
And no, it just reminded me. I mean, there's a tradition attributed, narrated by the prophet, speaking on behalf of God, that God says, deal with, if you do not deal mercifully with creation, or deal mercifully with creation, so that I may deal mercifully with you, right? So when we treat other people, or when we're merciful to other people, particularly, that is, as you said, seen as us manifesting or in some way inhabiting the divine mercy, and that is the source of all mercy. So when we're merciful, we are drawing on that fountain, and so yeah, I think that's a wonderful observation.
Thank you, Isa. It's really interesting just seeing the different dimensions of leadership that's coming out of the different stories. But Yeah, so it's fascinating just looking at different lenses. Robbie, I wonder whether you'd like to share your text. Bob, is it possible to get that up? So Robbie Lee started out in Edinburgh studying theology. He went on to complete his PhD at Cambridge, working with David Ford, who was one of the founders of SR. He then became head of religion and philosophy at Highgate School and worked there for 8 years. But he's here now because he's very involved with the work of Rose Castle Foundation, which is the sponsor of this project. And he's based, Rose Castle is based in Cumbria, and is very passionate about all things to do with scriptural reasoning. So I'm so grateful that he could be with us this afternoon, because he has such a depth of experience, and I'm really excited to find out what he's going to bring for us. And so I'm going to pass over to you now, Robbie.
Thank you, and thank you for those lovely words, and such a pleasure to be here. Okay, so I've chosen a passage from John's Gospel. As you may know, there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is the 4th Gospel, the latest to be written. And each of those Gospels focuses on the life of Jesus, and they're very much told as a narrative of Jesus's birth, life, his ministry, and then his betrayal, his arrest, his death, crucifixion, and ultimately his resurrection. So we're picking up in the narrative that there's an encounter between 2 leaders, 2 very different types of leaders. It's an encounter between Jesus, who has been arrested by the Roman authorities and is now standing trial before Pontius Pilate. Pilate is the Roman governor of the province of Judea, and is therefore in charge of the city of Jerusalem, which is where Jesus is spending the week of Passover. And of course, it's the culmination of his life, because after he's been betrayed by Judas, and this has just happened in the story before the passage I'm about to read, Jesus is betrayed, arrested, and then what will happen after the encounter that we're about to see between Pontius Pilate and Jesus is that Jesus is eventually sentenced to death, and he's humiliated, mocked, beaten brutally, and ultimately crucified, which is a really appalling, horrible, brutal way to die. And then, of course, the culmination of the gospel for Christians is that Jesus is resurrected. It's interesting just to think, as we read through this passage, what are the different models of leadership on display? And that's really why I chose this text. On the one hand, we have the kind of colonial political leadership embodied by Pontius Pilate, who is ultimately expedient because he makes the decision, despite finding that Jesus has done nothing wrong and doesn't deserve arrest, he makes the decision nevertheless to have Jesus sentenced to death by crucifixion. And that's because he's convinced by a very small number of religious authorities, temple authorities, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, that it would be wise, politically expedient for him to have Jesus killed. And so Jesus is executed really as a matter of expedience. So we can think about the political leadership embodied in Pontius Pilate, but we can also think about the religious leadership, or lack of leadership, one might say, embodied by the temple authorities, and then contrast that with Jesus's quite countercultural embodiment of a different type of leadership. Okay, so this is John chapter 18, verses 33 to 38. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" After he said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him." So I think I'll probably leave it to pose some questions to the room, perhaps, and say, what kind of authority, what kind of leadership does Jesus embody? How is that different from the sort that Pilate embodies? And maybe we'll take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. I wonder if I could invite Isa. Would you like to respond first? Is there anything that's come out of that that has struck you or that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think this is a powerful passage, and I mean, for me, it seems to be sort of encapsulated in Pilate's last bit of dialogue, where he asks, "What is truth?" And I don't know if I'm reading this right, but I mean, it seems like the kind of culmination of this sequence where he's just completely not understanding this man in front of him, you know, because he asks him, you know, so he's trying to work out, "Are you a king?" You know, and he doesn't understand the answer. He just repeats the question, and then Jesus starts talking about truth, and you know, he's just saying, "What is, you know, well, what's that? You know, what that has no currency with me. Why should I care about truth?" And if I don't know if that's, I suppose my question is that what's happening here? Is this the case? Is this a case of a man whose priority is so different that you just can't understand why, for the life of him, that this man, you know, in front of him is doing what he's doing and why he's saying what he's saying?
Yeah, thank you, Isa. I certainly think so. I think that question, "What is truth?" is one of the most sort of hotly contested questions in the New Testament, and I don't have an overview or a neatly packaged answer to it. But I think you're absolutely spot on that there's that. You know, Pilate is kind of tone deaf. He has Jesus standing right in front of him, and he just keeps asking, you know, "Who are you? What kind of leader are you? Are you the king of the Jews?" I don't. He seems not to understand what Jesus is about. So the question for me is, you know, we might translate that question not what is truth, but who is truth? And you said beautifully that truth seems to have no currency with Pilate, and I think that that's a really fascinating question. What has currency for us? To what are we attracted as leaders? And Jesus is the embodiment of truth. You know, this whole narrative is, I guess, the playing out of a kind of truth. He's, before this part of the story, before he's betrayed, he washes the feet of his disciples. He's the servant leader, and he asks them to serve each other in the same way for the sake of unity, community, love, compassion, goodness. And Judas, one of his own disciples, completely ignores that request and betrays him. And here's Pilate, completely unaware of who this person is and how he embodies a certain kind of truth that's very countercultural. And it's, if it wasn't for the climax of the story with the resurrection, I suppose it would be the ultimately sad story, because here we have the very embodiment of a particular kind of truth. And so many of the characters in the story are just absolutely not attracted into that truth. Jesus asks the question, or Jesus says, you know, whoever belongs to the truth listens to my voice. And one of the recurring motifs and what we have in this very passage is people who are absolutely tone deaf. and for whom truth has no currency, no attraction. So yes, I think an interesting question for us when we think about leadership in the Christian tradition is not what is leadership and what are the characteristics of a leader, but who are leaders? What kind of people are they? How do they embody a certain type of truth that might be really countercultural for us today?
Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Isa. I just want to invite Vicky, because time is ticking on. Is there anything that struck you that you would like to comment on?
Yes, I really enjoyed the way you set this up as kind of types of leadership and what types of leadership are kind of on display here. And as you've been talking as well, it becomes more and more clear that to me that Pilate is in a position of authority, but he's not demonstrating leadership, right? I mean, he doesn't even seem to know what he's got to try and do in this situation, right? You don't get a sense of what he's actually trying to hold Jesus into account for, and it becomes clear why. And the more you speak about it, because he is responding to Judas and the others who are seeking to press charges and in a position of authority. He is making casting judgment. Whereas what comes across, in Jesus's response is, that sense of purpose, of kind of calling, not being swayed by the circumstances, but and to me that's a genuine expression of leadership. So yeah, I find that really quite beautiful story. Thank you.
That's a really wonderful distinction between the execution of authority and leadership. And I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but that's exactly right. If you listen to secular historians describe Pontius Pilate, they always say, well, Pontius Pilate was a good leader because he does exactly what the Roman Empire would have required of him. He's a troublemaker, or somebody perceived as a troublemaker, and he has him put down. That's the, ultimate sort of political expediency. And we shouldn't paint Pilate in such negative terms because he just does what the ancient world required of him. And that's true to some extent, but the execution of authority and doing what the job requires expediently is not the same as embodying leadership. And, I had a list of the sort of qualities of leadership on display, and what would we think of secular leadership? Well, it might be something along the lines of sort of authority, power, control, status, visibility, or autonomy, pride. But Jesus, throughout the whole narrative and culminating with his death after this, is about truth, vulnerability, passivity, failure, the ultimate failure, being crucified in this most appalling way, obscurity, humiliation. These are not words we normally associate with leaders, but what they indicate, I think, in the narrative arc, is Jesus's concern is not for himself. His concern is for transformative action for the world and for the sake of his community, which is shaped in radical love. And that, I think, might be an answer to this question of what is truth, that Pilate, who executes his authority with great gusto, just totally misses.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you. It has been such a joy unpacking some of what's involved with those texts. And I have seen so many things that I didn't see when I read them myself. But I think one of the things that came out to me, just listening to all three stories, is how leaders were always concerned for the other people. There was a kind of concern for those who they were responsible for, and wanting good for them. I know there were very different dimensions of the aspect of leadership, but yes, thank you.